Ian is Emeritus Professor of Science, Technology and Society at Griffith University, an Adjunct Professor at the Sunshine Coast University and QUT, Queensland University of Technology, and an Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Adelaide. He's an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2001 for services to science and technology, particularly the environment, and he's been awarded numerous medals and awards: the Centenary Medal, the Eureka Prize, the Prime Minister's Environment Award and the Queensland Premier's Millennium Award. And of course he's known to most of us as Chair and enormously effective Chair of the Australian Conservation Foundation. Ian.
Thank you very much. Most of that's still accurate, but I'm no longer associated with the University of Adelaide, but I am associated with Flinders University, which is either a step up or a step down, depending on your prejudices. Could I just, before what I intended to say, respond to Hugh's comment about the conservation movement generally? And I think historically it is an accurate comment that the environment movement has been devoted to preventing the latest atrocity. And so there is a perception that it's trying to keep things as they are. And I think that's because historically the conservation movement grew out of atrocities that had to be stopped, whether it was sand mining on Moreton Island or logging of Fraser Island or destroying old-growth forests. But I've argued for 20 years now that if the conservation movement has a future, it has to move on from preventing atrocities to developing and articulating a vision of what we would like Australia to be and promoting that vision. So one of the 4 activities of the Australian Conservation Foundation is now called Living Within Our Means, which is about developing and articulating a view of how Australians could live in balance with natural systems. And if I could immodestly self-promote, my little book, A Big Fix, was specifically about showing how Australians could live in balance with natural systems and arguing that that would be a better way of living than what we're now doing. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about energy and society, and it builds partly on what David has to say. It includes another issue, which is peak oil, and it illustrates the reason that Ross Garnaut described climate change as a diabolical problem, and energy generally is a diabolical problem, is that energy is essentially the key to our relatively comfortable living. The reason we live more comfortably than our grandparents, the reason we live more comfortably than most people on the planet today, is that we are able to do things that could not be done, or do things that could be done only with the expenditure of huge amounts of human muscle power, relatively easily as a result of using fossil fuel energy. So whether it's using a vacuum cleaner to get the floor clean, or using petrol to move more easily from one place to another, or using electricity to knead the bread in a bread maker rather than muscling it around, or electricity to wash clothes, our life is more comfortable as a result of using energy. And we use energy at the rate of about 6 kilowatts per person in Australia. If you divide the national energy use by the number of people, that's much more energy than you're conscious of using. It's about what it takes to drive a small car at 50 kilometres an hour, or 6 1-bar radiators. And the fact that you're not conscious of using 6 1-bar radiators or a small car at 50 kilometres an hour now doesn't mean that there are people in Tasmania huddled over 12 radiators to make up for you slackers in Victoria who aren't doing your bit. It's a reflection of the fact that we don't just use energy in ways that we're aware of when we turn on a light switch or put fuel in a vehicle. Energy is an input to our buildings, our clothes, our food, every aspect of modern life. And in that sense, energy is not just crucial because it allows us to see in the dark. Energy is crucial because it allows us to have a varied diet. Energy is crucial because it allows us to have houses and the other things that we see around us. And it's arguably the key to other shortages. When faced with water shortage as a result of climate change, Perth commissioned a desalination plant. The shortage of water is resolved by using more energy. If you're short of minerals because you've exhausted rich grades of ore, you can process poorer grades of ore, but that takes more energy. You can farm more intensively to produce more food from the same land area if you have usable quantities of energy. But if you don't have usable energy, then society literally grinds to a halt. So the problem of climate change is how do we maintain material living standards while using significantly less energy? That's not the only issue. There's another issue that's been around for longer than climate change. It's, I suppose, hard for the sort of people we appoint to lead us to discern any sort of pattern in a graph like this, which shows the discovery of large oil fields, but to the untutored eye it looks like there's a bit of a peak and a bit of a subsequent decline. The notion of peak oil has been around since Marion King Hubbard predicted in 1956 that US oil production would peak in the early 1970s, probably causing a rearrangement of world oil markets. And nobody took it seriously until that happened in the 1970s OPEC oil crisis. People then did calculations on the global picture, and I was giving public lectures in 1977 pointing out that the best estimate of when world oil production would peak was about 2010, and saying fortunately that gave us 30 years to plan a smooth transition. The best estimate of when world oil production will peak is still about 2010. We've already passed the peak of conventional oil. We're expanding oil production from the polar regions and deep water, and there's some optimism that gas condensates might push the peak out to somewhere around 2012 or maybe even 2015. But there's no fundamental disagreement with the fact that we are at or near the peak of world oil production. We're using it at about 1 million times the rate at which natural systems are replenishing it. And that is arguably an even more urgent issue than climate change, because if you think about it, our entire transport system is based on the clearly invalid assumption that there will always be cheap transport fuels. And if we were a rational species, we would probably now be conserving the limited resources of petroleum fuels for issues for which it's essentially the only vector, like lubricants and civil aviation, rather than encouraging people to use it to drive inefficiently onto a vehicle. Or even more absurdly, in some states, encouraging people to fuel vehicles and drive them around in circles just to see which one can go the fastest. David's mentioned the issue of climate change and the fact that the business-as-usual projection of Australian emissions, which economists and practitioners of some other fringe religions are still talking about, with emissions increasing to almost double the present level by the middle of the century. Our Kyoto target is stabilising at the present level, and where we really need to go is somewhere around 90% reductions by the middle of this century. There's some disagreement among the community about what should be our target for carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. The current level is 380 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and if you add in the other greenhouse gases, it's about 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent. The conservative view in political circles is that we might aim to try and stabilise at 550 parts per million. Most scientists are saying 450 parts per million is about the upper limit, and there is a view in some scientific circles that we should be aiming at 350 parts per million, which is significantly lower than we are now. And what is probably the greatest understatement ever published in the scientific paper, Hansen et al. Say that setting a target of 350 parts per million, while they say it may not be enough to prevent dangerous climate change, would be sufficient to qualitatively change the discussion and drive fundamental changes in energy policy. And that's undoubtedly the case. If we're serious about a sustainable energy future, I believe there are 3 principles that we should accept. The first is a commitment to improving the efficiency of turning energy into the services that people want: transport, heating, cooling, lighting, motive power and so on. Because if you think about it, nobody actually wants energy. I've never heard anyone say, I've got to go and get some megajoules. Amory Lovins used to say people don't want energy, they want hot showers and cold beer. They want the capacity that energy gives us to modify our environment. And most of the technology we use to achieve those goals is still embarrassingly inefficient. There are quite respectable studies that show that we could live at the same level of material comfort using between half and a quarter of the energy we now use with technologies that exist and are economically viable today. These are sometimes described as low-hanging fruit, but I think it's more like fruit that are lying on the ground and you just have to bend over and pick them up. Some economists doubt the validity of this argument, but I think Paul Ehrlich memorably said these are the sort of people who, if they saw a $20 note lying on the ground, wouldn't pick it up, because if it was really a $20 note, somebody would already have picked it up. These efficiency gains are not a free lunch, they are a lunch you are paid to eat, because as David pointed out, most of them save money as well as saving emissions. Secondly, we need to move away from supply technologies that are based on problematic resources. If we don't, in a measured way, move away from exploiting the resources of oil, we will be forced to move away from them by shortages and by fighting amongst ourselves over the dwindling quantities. And thirdly, we need to move away from technologies that impose unacceptable environmental costs, and the most obvious one there is climate change. And in case you think that it's only university scientists and other people who can't earn an honest living who are saying this sort of thing, the International Energy Agency, which is the global voice of the energy industry, which only 2 years ago was still talking about the use of coal doubling by 2030 and nuclear power stations on every street corner, said in its 2008 report on the World Energy Outlook that we need nothing short of an energy revolution to cope with the twin problems of peak oil and climate change. Now, the good news, if you think about electricity supply, which is our largest contributor of carbon dioxide, none of the 2050 supply has yet been built. So we are taking policy decisions literally every year from now on that will determine the shape of our electricity industry by the middle of this century, and certainly none of the 2080 electricity supply has yet been built. So we will make conscious decisions that either perpetuate old-fashioned, dirty ways of providing electricity or implement new and clean ways of providing electricity. And the fundamental point, I think, is that unless carbon capture and storage is proven, I think the only form of carbon capture and storage that actually works is vegetation. That's got a proven track record over a few billion years, whereas the programs that are being talked about are not proven technically, economically or environmentally, or an even bigger if nuclear power became viable technically, socially, economically and environmentally. All new supply really has to be a mix of renewables. The good news is that renewable resources are enormous, literally thousands of times greater than human energy demand, and I remind people that the amount of solar energy that hits Australia alone in one summer day alone is comparable to the total global annual world energy use. I'll say that again because most people have difficulty believing it. The entire world, all 6.5 billion humans in an entire year, total energy use for everything, cooking, heating, lighting, transport, total global annual energy use is about twice the amount of solar energy that hits Australia alone in one summer day alone. And the other natural flows, wind, wave, tidal, geothermal, are comparable in scale, all literally thousands of times greater than human energy need. And there have been two significant studies in Australia, this one published by the Department of Resources and Energy, staid conservative old department in Canberra, populated by coal industry dinosaurs and people who want to build nuclear power stations. Their discussion paper number 2 in 1992 said that we could get 30% of our electricity by 2020 from renewables, and that would increase the cost by about 1 cent a kilowatt hour. And if we went the full Monty and got all of our electricity from renewables by 2030, which is technically possible, that would cost about an extra 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Interestingly, I've argued that if you gave the people that choice and said, we will not build any more coal-fired power stations, we'll convert totally to a mix of renewables, we'll at the same time implement world's best practice in energy efficiency, which will probably halve the electricity demand of a typical household. So it might cost an extra $5 or $10 a week by 2030 to be totally dependent on clean energy. Is that acceptable? I can't believe that that would not be politically acceptable today if we had politicians with a bit of vision and a bit of leadership. A more recent report that ACF was involved in, A Bright Future, said we could still get 25% of our electricity by 2020, despite 20 years of inaction. and that would cost the average Australian household about $1 a week and incidentally produce 17,000 new jobs, which, to put it in perspective, is more than half the total employment in the entire coal industry, domestic and export. We're encouraged to believe we can't do anything unless a job is lost somewhere in the coal industry. In terms of transport, this may well be a vision of the future. Perth is one of 11 cities participating in a trial of hydrogen fuel cell buses, and I remind people that Iceland is an example of what we might try to emulate. The small country of Iceland is one of several countries that gets most or all of its electricity from a mix of renewables now, in case you believe the nonsense that renewables can't provide baseload electricity. Renewables provide all of Iceland's electricity, almost all of Norway's, almost all of New Zealand's, almost all of that advanced civilization in Tasmania, for that matter. So it's entirely possible. And Iceland in 1999 decided to move on from getting all of their electricity from renewables to use renewable electricity to split seawater into hydrogen and oxygen and run their transport system on hydrogen fuel cells. And the first step was to convert their buses, the second step will be ocean-going trawlers, and the third step will be the car fleet. And New Scientist reporting this in 1999 said Iceland had three advantages that allowed us to do something radical like this. They're an island community, so they can make independent decisions about their transport. They have a relatively small population per unit land area, so they have plentiful renewable resources, and they have a good base in science and technology so that they could do something radically different. And I said to a conference, it's a pity we didn't have those advantages in Australia, or we might have been able to do something similar. Of course, we have all of those advantages. What New Scientist didn't say was that Iceland had a fourth advantage, which is politicians looking 20 years ahead and making long-term decisions. Just two other points about transport, that urban planning is critical because people make rational decisions, and if you build sprawling cities with no facilities anywhere near where people live, they will drive cars to get the facilities. But people don't come to cities so they can drive around. They come to cities to access the social and economic and work and cultural opportunities that cities provide. And it's only if by poor urban planning you make those facilities inaccessible that people demand mobility to get to the inaccessible services. These figures are from a study done by Peter Newman and Jeff Kenworthy comparing two new cities built in the 1970s. If you look at the bottom line, the Dutch city has twice as many dwellings per hectare, and if you look at the second bottom line as a consequence, in the Dutch city 85% of trips are less than 3 kilometres, in the English city it's less than half. And as a result, in the English city many more people use the car, in the Dutch city many more people use the bicycle, because people are rational. If you have a short trip to get a bottle of milk or a newspaper or to go to school, you will use a bicycle. If it's a long trip, you will use a litre of petrol to get the litre of petrol litre of milk when you find you run out late at night. I just wanted to say something about the humble bicycle, which we usually regard as a transport technology for young people until they can graduate to something more dangerous. But the bicycle uses totally renewable fuels like Weet-Bix rather than non-renewable fuels like oils. It is the most efficient transport vehicle that has ever been designed. It uses about 1/50th of the energy per person kilometre of the car. It assists physical fitness, which is also a significant health problem in our society. The infrastructure is a lot cheaper, and it accounts for between 30 and 40% of all journeys in some quite civilised European cities. And to overcome the cost barrier, that it costs a couple $100 to buy a decent bicycle, several European cities now have rental schemes where you swipe a credit card, you get your takeaway bicycle, and if you return it to another rental site within half an hour, it costs you nothing. If you don't return it within half an hour, the clock starts ticking and you pay by the hour, and if you don't return it at all, your credit card is debited with the cost of a bicycle. Interestingly, even Brisbane's Lord Mayor, who's hardly in the van of practical modern thinking about transport, thinks this is such a good idea that he's talking about introducing rental bicycles to Brisbane. I just wanted to make a point about intergenerational equity before some closing comments. In a rational world, as I said, we'd be conserving petroleum fuels for uses with no easy substitutes. Allocating any resource whether it's energy resources or other resources, through a market mechanism means that the wishes of this generation take precedence over the needs of all future generations. And couched in those terms, it's clearly morally indefensible, which is why it's rarely couched in those terms. But it's a strong argument for not allowing market forces always to prevail, that this generation will always demand more than an equitable share. And as Hugh and David have both said, this generation's decisions are putting significant pressures on future generations. The World Commission on Environment and Development, which published the report Our Common Future in 1987 and brought the phrase sustainable development into common parlance, said a safe, environmentally sound and economically viable energy source to sustain human progress into the distant future is clearly imperative. It's also possible, but it will require new dimensions of political will and institutional cooperation to achieve it. It's not a technical problem, it's a matter of developing the social institutions and the political will that enable that transition. I've suggested, at Amanda's request, 10 priorities. We should accept significant cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, at least 40% by 2020, and effectively decarbonisation by 2050. We should move to world's best practice in energy efficiency for buildings, appliances, vehicles, because that provides economic benefits as well as environmental. We should have ambitious renewable targets, and in most of mainland Australia we should see solar hot water as the default technology for providing hot water. It's economically viable almost everywhere in Australia, so we'd be doing people an economic favour by mandating it. We should phase out the $9 billion or so of public dollars that are now used to subsidise the supply and use of fossil fuels, and instead put those funds into developing cleaner energy technologies and more efficient use. We need real incentives for clean energy use, whether that's a carbon tax or a properly designed emissions trading scheme, rather than a bodgy one where we say there'll be a price on carbon, but if you use a lot of it, we'll give you the money so it doesn't cost you anything, which Brian Toohey said is like taxing tobacco and then saying every smoker will get a handout so that it doesn't actually cost them any more to buy cigarettes. We need effective public transport for urban areas, and that means we need to be planning for compact urban villages. And that's something we really need to start immediately, because our urban planning is literally setting in concrete what the structures will be for 50 to 100 years. Final 2 points. I think public authorities have to embody world's best practice rather than saying, as governments often do, take our advice, we're not using it. Governments can't expect the community to take energy conservation and clean energy seriously if they're not. And finally, and this goes back to what Hugh and David were saying, if we're going to make these difficult decisions, I believe we need to involve the whole community in a social learning process in which we're making conscious decisions about how we will live in the future, rather than assuming that everything will be driven by short-term economic priorities. So it's implicit in what I've been saying that our decisions are shaping the future. Our aim should be a sustainable future, and that has many dimensions. But the fundamental point is that the present pattern of energy supply and use is unsustainable. It has to change because of the limitations on resources. It has to change because of the damage that we're now doing to natural systems, particularly through climate change. And the key to concerted change is better social institutions and developing the political will for significant change. And just to show that you can start at the local level, I like this advertising campaign now being used by one of our brewers. Thank you very much.